Hello, students. Today, we are going to travel back in time to Russia more than 100 years ago. It was a time of great change, ruled by a powerful king called the Tsar. But, under the surface, new ideas, forbidden ideas, were spreading in secret. These ideas would eventually lead to a revolution that changed the whole world. Let's explore the story of Russia in 1905, a very important year that was like a practice run for an even bigger historical event.
So, here is our plan for today's lesson. First, we'll see how socialist ideas had to grow in secret. Then, we'll look at how the people who believed in these ideas had different opinions, which led to a big split. After that, we will learn about a single terrible event called Bloody Sunday that started a huge wave of protests. We'll see how these protests spread all across the Russian Empire, and finally, we'll understand why this revolution of 1905 is called a dress rehearsal for the big revolution of 1917. All right, let's start with our first section, socialism in secret. Now, to understand why these new ideas had to be discussed in hiding, we first need to understand the kind of power the ruler of Russia had. This is Tsar Nicholas II. He was the ruler of the huge Russian Empire. Now, Russia at that time was what we call an autocracy. This is a very important word. It means that the Tsar had complete and total power. In other countries in Europe, kings had to listen to a parliament. But in Russia, there was no one to question the Tsar. His word was the final law. So you see, in a system like this, you are not allowed to disagree with the ruler. Any kind of political party was completely illegal. If you wanted to talk about new ideas like socialism, you could get into serious trouble. You had to do it secretly, always afraid that the Tsar's police might find you. But even with this great danger, people did form political parties in secret. Two main socialist parties were formed. In 1898, the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party was created, and in 1900, the Socialist Revolutionary Party was founded. Both of these groups wanted a better future for Russia, but they had very different ideas on how to get there. And this brings us to our next section, a party divided. You see, these revolutionaries who were fighting against the Tsar couldn't even agree among themselves. This disagreement was so serious that it would split their movement into different groups. So what was this big disagreement about? Well, it was about a simple question. Who should lead the revolution? The socialist revolutionaries believed that the peasants, the farmers in the villages, should be the main force. They felt peasants were natural socialists. Their main demand was to take the land from the rich nobles and give it to the peasants. But the Social Democrats did not agree. They believed that the industrial workers in the cities were the ones who would bring revolution. They thought the peasants were not a single united group and couldn't lead a change. This argument became so big that the Social Democratic Party itself split into two groups. One group was called the Bolsheviks, which means majority. They were led by this man, Vladimir Lenin. The other group was called the Mensheviks, which means minority. Let's understand this split a little more clearly. Lenin, who led the Bolsheviks, said that because they were working in a country where they could be arrested any time, their party should be very disciplined and organized. He wanted to control the number of members and ensure they were all committed revolutionaries. Think of it like a small, highly trained team. On the other hand, the Mensheviks wanted the party to be open to everyone, just like in other European countries. They wanted something more like a large club where anyone could join. This difference in thinking was very, very important for the future. Now we come to the event that actually started the revolution. By the year 1904, life had become very difficult for the workers in Russia. The country was like a pile of dry wood, just waiting for a single spark to set it on fire. You see, 1904 was a very bad year. The prices of essential things like bread went up sharply. At the same time, the actual wages that workers earned went down by 20%. The final trigger was when 4 workers were fired from a big factory called the Putilov Iron Works. In protest, over 110,000 workers in the city of St. Petersburg went on strike. They stopped working and demanded better conditions. This strike led to a peaceful march. A large group of workers, led by a priest named Father Gapon, decided to go to the Tsar's palace directly. They carried a petition, a letter, asking for better pay and working hours. They believed the Tsar would help them. But when they reached the Winter Palace, they were not met by the Tsar. Instead, they were attacked by the police and the Cossacks, who were the Tsar's soldiers. The result was a terrible tragedy. Over 100 workers who were completely peaceful and unarmed were killed. About 300 more were wounded.
For a long time, the Russian people had thought of the Tsar as their protector, their little father. On that day, that belief was completely destroyed.
And this event, which we now know as Bloody Sunday, was the spark. It did not scare the people into silence. No. It filled them with anger and started a series of events that we call the 1905 Revolution. The news of Bloody Sunday spread like wildfire. The violence did not stop the protests. It actually made them much bigger. The revolution was no longer just in the capital city. It spread to every corner of the vast Russian Empire. Suddenly, everyone was protesting. There were strikes all over the country. University students walked out of their classes. Even educated professionals like lawyers, doctors, and engineers started demanding a constitution to limit the Tsar's power. And out in the countryside, the peasants also rose up. They refused to pay rent and sometimes even attacked their landlords. It was a revolt by the entire Russian society. Now, with his entire empire and revolt, the Tsar had to do something. He finally gave in a little and agreed to create an elected parliament. This parliament was called the Duma. But the question was this a real change? Or was the Tsar just trying to calm everyone down for a while?
So what was this Duma? It was an elected parliament. Yes, but look at this word here, consultative. This is the key. A consultative parliament can only give advice to the ruler. It cannot make laws on its own or go against the ruler's wishes. And very soon it became clear that the Tsar was not serious about sharing his power. The first Duma was dismissed by him in just 75 days. When a second Duma was elected, he dismissed that one too in less than 3 months. After that, he simply changed the voting laws so that only people who supported him could get elected. It was very obvious he had no intention of giving up his absolute power.
And this brings us to our last and most important section. The 1905 revolution did not succeed in removing the Tsar, but it was not a failure. In fact, many historians call it a dress rehearsal for the main event, the revolution that was going to happen in 1917.
So why was it a useful rehearsal? Well, for the first time, people saw that the Tsar's government was not all-powerful. It could be challenged. The revolution also brought many different kinds of people, workers, peasants, doctors, together against one enemy. And most importantly, it gave ordinary people their first experience in political action. They learned how to organize strikes and protests. This experience was the practice they needed for the successful revolution that would finally remove the Tsar in 1917.
Before we end, let's clear up 2 common mistakes people make. First, the Tsar was not removed from power in 1905. He continued to rule for another 12 years. And second, it's important to remember that not everyone who protested was a socialist. There were also liberals who just wanted a constitution, and other groups who wanted more freedom for their regions.
And that leads us to our final question to think about. After this dress rehearsal in 1905, where the people showed they were ready to fight, and the Tsar showed he was not ready to change, was the final fall of the Tsar in 1917 bound to happen? Was it just a matter of time? Thank you for joining this lesson.